There's no further ado, I will introduce our first speaker. Dr. Emma Ruttkamp-Bloem is a professor of philosophy in the Department of Philosophy at the Faculty of Humanities with the University of Pretoria. She is the head of the Ethics of Artificial Intelligence Research Group at the Center for Artificial Intelligence Research in South Africa. Dr. Ruttkamp-Bloem will address culture as AI ethics calculus. The floor is yours, Professor.
Thank you. Let me just try to do the mechanics, the screen sharing. Okay. Right. Theoretically, you can see my screen. I'm sure someone will tell me if that's not the case. So I'm going to talk to you about culture as an AI ethics calculus. The context of my talk will be the context of the possibility of global policymaking on AI ethics. So we all know that there are over 160 different kinds of guidelines at the moment on AI ethics. They are not all global ones, intergovernmental, national, professional policies, policies generated in the private sector, and so on. But what they all share is that most of them, or we can maybe, until we see the impact of the new EU regulations, have had very little real practical impact. And there are various reasons for this in recent literature in AI ethics. Some say that there are too few directives on enforcement, oversight, compliance. There's a lack of distributed responsibility. These are ideas that are encapsulated in these regulations that come from outside the tech community, so they lack comprehension and knowledge of long-term social consequences. But the one that I want to focus on is the fact that these documents are, in all cases up to now, culturally uneven. So one supposition in the debate on AI ethics and on global regulation for AI ethics is that for successful global standards, the notion of shared values may be the way to go. But how would decisions be made on what exactly should be in such a set of shared values? Who would decide what the set comprises of? Are there, in fact, any such values? And why is it important to have culture enter this debate as interlocutor and not others, such as human rights law? So I think it is important that culture becomes a very distinct part of this debate. And I will say one or two words about human rights law and international law in general as we go along, but the focus here is on culture, and it's an essential ingredient. Why is this so? I think it is because we need to acknowledge that AI ethics is a dynamic system, has to be a dynamic system, in order to enable the AI lifecycle responsibly, because we need full adoption of technology to enable its benefits. And for full adoption, we need dynamics. Reasons for this: the technology is fast changing. Let's try and hide this little thing that speaks to me. Oh, sorry, I didn't want to do that. Sorry, I just want to go back to my screen. Am I still sharing my screen? Oh, what did I do now? Sorry.
Yes, you're still sharing the screen.
Right. Okay. Sorry, that was my fault. Sorry. And again, I'll find it. Okay. So the reason is that as the technology is fast changing, there is a dynamic status of different contexts within which the technology is applied. And then the cultural content of the ethical systems in question is dynamic. And I will focus on the last two, on context and on culture, but specifically on culture. But if we talk about this, we have to understand that this debate is really complex and that there are quite a few elements among which there are different kinds of tensions. So just quickly, First, a complex element. Ethics is the medium through which decisions are made about what the right thing to do is. So we have moral dilemmas, we have questions about what the right thing to do is, and we answer these questions by appealing to some kind of ethical system. There are different ethical systems. There is deontology, there's virtue ethics, there's communitarianism, there's religion and different kinds of religion, but the choice of ethical system is a cultural one. Then secondly, in terms of AI ethics, culture matters because for a global policy to be successful, it should belong to every role player as an active participant, not as something just in terms of an add-on. This means that the terms of these policies must be familiar and acceptable to every participant. Another element, context matters too. And this notion of context and relevance, I'll say something about this in a minute, a bit more, but it ranges over a very complex continuum of dimensions, including culture, politics, economic status, infrastructure, and so on. Then another component of this debate is transnational companies, the existence of these bad things, and the notion of net states. So we are citizens of our own countries, but we're also citizens of net states that go across country borders. And this means that we need a mechanism that can span cultures. And negotiation can only happen if role players can understand each other. And then just to complexify matters even more and bring in more tension, there is the issue of epistemic injustice, hermeneutic and testimonial injustice. So testimonial injustice, we don't hear people because of some kind of identity prejudice in terms of some kind of social grouping, and hermeneutic injustice in the sense that we don't think that members of certain groups have the conceptual means to interpret and make sense of this social reality. So they need the hegemonic group to do this for them. And linked to this is the notion of alternative epistemologies. So what happens often in these contexts is that there is one epistemology in which all vocabulary is formulated. So it is hard to make oneself heard anyway, because you cannot articulate your thoughts because the vocabulary, the epistemic vocabulary doesn't belong to you. So that's just to tell you how complex the situation is. But let's just say a few words on context because it relates to culture and you'll see why. So a quote from Haggerty and Rubinoff, and I've forgotten to put the bibliography, but I'll add it if anybody wants my slides. AI is likely to have markedly different social impacts depending on geographical setting. Likewise, perceptions and understandings of AI, and I add, addressing its disruption and successfully mitigating its potential harm, are likely to be profoundly shaped by local cultural and social context. An example is the Myanmar and Facebook misinformation fiasco in 2018, which was due partly, or maybe mainly, because of Facebook's failure to address the political and social realities in Myanmar at the time. So culture is important, and we'll say a lot about culture in what comes, but the social, economic, and political context within which values are formulated and in which policies are expected to be applied, and these contexts are very seldom the same, which is part of the problem, of the reason for this talk. But this kind of context is really very important as well. So relevance is really key to political, or to policy, sorry, not political, to policy success. I live in South Africa. Political is just a word that comes out of my mouth naturally. Okay, so what I want to show you a bit what I mean about context by telling you what the context, for instance, in Africa is like when we have to think about AI ethics. Africa is a continent where there are a host of ethnic and religious differences among states, but also within states. There are different tribes within the same country. There's often political instability and weak governance structures. There's digital AI ethics, information and communication literacy issues, access to quality education and inequalities in education. Inequality in education is just as important as quality in education. In South Africa, for instance, a baby girl has a higher chance to be raped than to learn to read. And that's a statistic that keeps me awake at night. So Then implementation of policies and legislation is slow. Connectivity, internet penetrability, and cost of data are real problems. Internet penetrability of the continent ranges from something like 2% in South Sudan to up in the 70s and 80s in countries such as Kenya, Nigeria, and South Africa. Cost of data can cost up to 75% of your income if you're a middle income person in Africa, in certain countries. There are energy issues. To be connected, you need electricity. There are many places in Africa that do not have electricity. In South Africa, we have something called load shedding. So there are certain hours of days at certain stages where we simply do not have electricity. And then Africa has been excluded from the global discourse. And then ethics and religion are woven very tightly together in Africa. Sometimes difficult for in certain contexts to see how there can be other ethical systems than religion to address moral issues. So if we look at the UNESCO Needs Assessment Survey that was done earlier this year in Africa, what is interesting is that African states asked for support from UNESCO in terms of standard setting, policy advice, capacity building, network development, and for addressing gender issues in the context of AI and AI ethics, but not really in the context of anything to do with culture. Now, to take us from context to culture, I want to give you an example of a set of non-Western values in the context of AI ethics, and then I'll compare it to a Western set of values, just to make the link between context and culture. So I've chosen the values of a natural language processing group. So it's not AI ethics in general, but it will serve the purpose. The group is called Masakani, which actually means working together or building together. So they have, their first value is the value of Ubuntu. And this is the value that implies that a person is never an individual, but a person is only a person through other persons. Not I am because I think, I am because you are. Then African centricity is another value, reasserting a new way of looking at information from an African perspective. Ownership, Africans should be in charge of owning, driving, and participating in AI ethics processes rather than be observers or data providers. And that's a very, very sore issue in Africa. Openness, sharing, content, multidisciplinarity, everyone has valuable knowledge, kindness, responsibility, data sovereignty, big issue in Africa. Africans should be able to decide what data represents our communities globally and to retain ultimate ownership of that data and know how it's used. Issues around reproducibility, sustainability. So if we compare this list, so let me just say something about this list before we go to the north. You will see that some of these values are culturally driven, such as the value of Ubuntu, for instance, and maybe the value of kindness. Everyone has valuable knowledge. Then there are also values such as data sovereignty and ownership and African centricity, which speaks to the context, to context related to epistemic injustice, to context related to economic and political situations, and so on. So there is an interplay between context and culture. If we compare to Western values, I'm not going to read all of them. The Western values are far more abstract and somehow at a distance. So that when we get to the actual matter, that culture matters, I think what is very important is that we should insist in our ethics context that values should always be interpreted. There should be a definition for the value. And there are in most policy documents, but there are definitions. But the problem is how those definitions are formulated and who formulates the definitions. So to interpret values there's a need to give meaning to abstract concepts, to anchor them, to hook them onto the real world. And we do this via different ethical systems that are culturally driven. This implies that we have to allow culture as an interlocutor into the AI ethics conversation. So the meaning of a value is mapped onto a particular understanding of it based on the specific culture via a certain ethical system. So there's a lot of contextuality built into this whole process. So rather than having one-to-one mappings of meaning, just accepting that everybody knows what you mean by protecting human dignity or by protecting privacy, there should be allowance for many-to-many mappings. Many-to-one mappings where we have different names for more or less the same value. Interestingly enough, there are Western values that really overlap very strongly with the notion of Ubuntu, solidarity and interconnectedness. For instance, if I think of Taoism in the Japanese culture, openness and inclusivity could refer to the same value. But then we also have one-to-many mappings. We have the same name, but we have differently interpreted values. And examples here are privacy and autonomy, but there are many others. So AI ethics regulation should be formulated in a context where different interpretations can be conveyed to the AI ethics community and built into the regulation process. But there have to be some basic rules of interpretation, and this is not, I think, a welcome message necessarily, but I think it is a necessary one. We cannot have discreteness of meaning because the threat of transnational companies is real, and we need to be able to understand each other, but this is a complex issue. While someone, for instance, here is an example, while someone who operates within a collectivist ethical system such as Ubuntu may be more inclined to comply with privacy protection if it is the privacy of the group that is at issue, it is not impossible for them to understand the threat to individual privacy. Versus the privacy legislation may be more meaningful within a collectivist culture if it is phrased as concerning a community rather than an individual. So while they could understand perhaps the concept in terms of an individual, it will have more impact if the value is phrased in terms of collectivism. So we have to address this issue of difference of meaning, such that it doesn't implode into discreteness. And we need to insist, secondly, that the meaning ascribed to values is articulated and is communicated. And this has to happen in a context of openness to diverse engagement and epistemic justice, such that the meaning can be heard. So it's not enough just to ask for articulation of the meaning within cultures. We must be open to hearing what people are saying. And I don't know how much time I have left because we didn't start at 3. I'll take a chance. I think I have just about 3 slides left. At the negotiations for the AI ethics recommendation at UNESCO last week, there is one non-Western value in this recommendation. And the reaction from member states, from representatives of member states, was on the whole, from the West, this kind of vocabulary is not supported. We don't know what interconnected means. We don't understand what you're trying to say. This is not captured in terms of international law. Throw it out. And then I was given a chance to explain why we added the value, and the value was accepted. So there is this need for articulation and openness. But there are problems. What about countries where AI ethics has no emphasis? We have to accept these differences, but I need to have this bottom line all the time. We have to ensure that we understand that socio-political context plays a role. Really, in some countries, it is more important to focus on feeding people or fighting gender-based violence than it is to be concerned about any kind of esoteric technology and its ethics. And then secondly, in many African, if I only speak for Africa, in many African states, as I've said, ethics is religion and belongs to the community. This is a system that belongs to a particular community. So ethics is not viewed as a mechanism to be freely purposed in different contexts. So one has to overcome this or communicate this and build this into the the way in which regulation is formulated. What about values that do not exist in some cultures, such as non-discrimination? So again, policies must be open and dynamic, but we have to understand, and there it is. I'm not a very dramatic person, but I really think that humanity is in danger. So here maybe be a role, here maybe is a role for human rights to say that, well, there are certain rights that simply cannot be transgressed, and in any way, this is international law. We can't go around that. What about relativism? So I'm devil's advocate a little bit here as well. There must be openness to otherness in AI ethics circles. Such an articulation of difference is heard, but culture cannot be used as a stalling or obfuscation mechanism. What about politics behind appeals to culture? That I saw a lot of in the negotiations last week. We have to use culture as a strength. But we have to insist on reasoning or articulation as well as minimum adherence to policies. So culture cannot become the excuse to enforce, for instance, unacceptable foreign policy that would put world peace in danger or anything like that. So there remains a context. So if we come back to successful global standard setting, then what am I saying? Culture is important. We cannot just have uninterpreted values as abstract concepts or originating within one dominant culture. There should be engagement with different interpretations such that there can be articulation and communication of ascribed meaning. Context and relevance are important in terms of culture, in terms of socio-political and socio-economic situations, and implications of context for impact assessment and compliance should be noted. The readiness status of a specific country has to be taken into account when we formulate these policies so that they can be dynamic enough, and the ethics carrying them should be dynamic enough to allow for different levels of readiness. So I think we could...
You are entering the 3 last minutes, yeah.
Good. I have two slides left. We could have successful global standard setting instruments if they are driven by all participants and based on diverse cultural input, if they are sensitive to the context, and if they're based on AI ethics as a dynamic system. So in conclusion, I stress that culture is a core element of the dynamics of AI ethics as a system, and also highlight that so is context. But while we embrace the difference of culture, we should not give up on global standards, and I believe this firmly, as there is one shared goal, which is to defend what is human, and the transnationality of big tech means we have to be able to have cross-cultural conversations in order to regulate these companies. Thus, we have to emphasize culture as an essential driver of the dynamics of AI ethics as a system, but we have to insist on rules of interpretation being clear and mean being articulable. So, last slide. This is exactly the problem, okay? There may be confusion between embracing the difference because culture matters and difference understood to mean incommunicability. This is a challenge to overcome to ensure we can engage and communicate while hearing each other as members of different cultures. The way to meet this challenge is not to turn into hegemonic forms of discourse, easy way out, but to work to have cultural difference actualize the dynamics of ethics for a shared human goal. To protect what is human is embracing culture, because this opens the potential for every person to feel understood and heard. So finding the secret to make cultural differences strength of AI ethics will put the power back in the hands of humans. This is our secret weapon. So I think there is an urgent need for a protocol for cultural engagement in AI ethics discussions such that we can unleash this power of embracing culture responsibly. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. That was really insightful. A lot of things to think about, definitely, and especially regarding values and the need that we have to be able to communicate, even if we do not share the same perspectives. That's something that is really important, and you're perfectly right about that. So thank you for all that.